for joining us today for this event on trade and animal welfare in sustainable food systems ahead of the UN Food Systems Summit. My name is Alberto Alemano. I'm a professor of law at HEC Paris, and I'm the founder of the Good Lobby, a nonprofit assisting civil society organization in their advocacy strategy. Eurogroup for Animals is the Brussels-based umbrella organization really representing the interest of 70 plus member societies all across Europe. Ahead of the 2021 UN Sustainable Food Systems Summit held in New York this week, as you all know, today's event aims to discuss how trade policy can help to promote higher animal welfare and thus to move towards more sustainable food systems. I think we have all been witnessing a major shift in attitudes regarding our food systems. We are leaving behind this comfortable assumption that we can deal separately with issues of hunger, health, climate change, environment, animal welfare, and livelihoods. We simply cannot, and all those issues are inextricably intertwined. But change is somehow resisted, either because the incentives are not really there to make this happen, or there are vested interests which are just too strong and they push back this kind of change. Before I turn to Reineke Hamelaers, the CEO of Eurogroup for Animals, let me say a few words about our agenda today. There will be two distinct panels, one focusing on the bilateral trade agreement perspective and how animal welfare is actually faring into there. And then we're going to moving into a more multilateral global level conversation with a different lineup of speakers. Regarding housekeeping, please keep yourself muted during the meeting. You all know to do this by now. Please add your questions using the Q&A function, and those will be addressed at the end of each panel. The meeting will be recorded, and this recording will be made available to all of you by the end of the day. There will also be live interpretation of the event from English to French. For those who feel more comfortable listening into French, it is already possible to do so. You can use this function by activating it on your Zoom window. Allow me now to welcome Reineke Hamelaers, the CEO of Eurogroup for Animals, who will be setting the stage for our discussion and its entire initiative of today. Please, Reineke, to you.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for this introduction. And once again, a warm welcome to all of you, also on behalf of Eurogroup for Animals. As Alberto already said, Eurogroup for Animals is the pan-European animal protection organization. We represent 80 member organizations in the EU and across the world. And we are delighted to co-host this event today, just ahead of the UN Food Systems Summit tomorrow. And we believe that the summit provides a real opportunity to create a momentum for the transition towards sustainable food systems, which is key if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So let me share a few thoughts with you about the impetus for this event. We are here today to discuss a topic that is often neglected, the impact of trade policy on animal welfare and how addressing this impact can contribute to the much needed transition towards sustainable food systems. Because at the moment, international trade and economic policies are fueling rather than countering the expansion and negative impacts of intensive livestock farming by prioritizing profits and free trade above all. For example, the trade deal between the EU and Ukraine has led to a surge in cheap chicken meat imports, and the ones planned with Australia, well, let's see about that one now, because of the submarine drama, but also with the Mercosur countries, will fuel beef production in those countries and also soy production in the Mercosur countries, mostly associated with feedlots. And this is according to the EU's own analysis. So there seems to be a disconnect between the discussions about the much needed transformation of our food systems and the international trade agenda. And that is really puzzling us. We know that the WTO has been discussing how to align their policies with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we haven't seen any concrete outcomes of that yet. So we hope that our debate today will contribute to a new discourse where a different trade model will be considered in the discussions about future food systems and in bilateral and multilateral trade discussions. And as we will hear more in depth from Philip Limbury, Global CEO of Compassionate World Farming and also President of Eurogroup for Animals, the intensive model of livestock farming spread by unconditional trade is a huge burden for our planet and its living creatures. It pollutes and destroys our air, soil, and water, and is responsible for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it is also the main contributor to the current surge in antimicrobial resistance. And very important for us, intensive livestock farming is very detrimental to the animals. Chickens, pigs, fish, and cattle have been reduced to commodities with the aim to produce cheap meat and dairy as fast and efficiently as possible. And there's really no way the animals can express their natural behaviors and live a life worth living. And despite this mounting evidence, and we read it almost every day, political leaders remain reluctant to take into account non-trade considerations such as animal welfare and sustainable food systems when designing trade policies. We noticed that the provisions in the trade agreements are really toothless at the moment and non-enforceable. And we believe that trade should remain a tool for good and not an end in itself. Trade should not aggravate the crises we are facing, but as the latest EU Commission Trade for All strategy insists, quite the opposite. Trade policies should contribute to resolving those crises. So now more than ever, we believe we must seize the opportunity offered by the UN Food Systems Summit to call on our leaders and to reconsider the role of animal welfare throughout global value chains and use the potential power of trade policies as a driver for animal welfare and sustainable food systems and bring those debates together. And that's why today we are thrilled to hear from our panels of expert policymakers, business leaders and academics how this can be done. And before we begin our first panel on bilateral trade and animal welfare, I would like to give the floor to a UN food champion and an animal champion, Philip Limbury. Philip, can I hand over to you? Thanks so much.
Reineke, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being part of this hugely important dialogue in the run-up to Thursday's UN Food Systems Summit. And I think that Thursday is a hugely important day. The summit is hugely important because it's talking about a much forgotten nexus issue in the battle to save the planet, and that is food. And I believe that the UN Food Systems Summit has been a success already in raising the profile of food and the need for transformation of food systems if we're to have a livable future. And trade is going to play a hugely important part in shaping food systems. It will necessarily be so if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, if we are to create a livable future going forward. And one of the reasons why I accepted the role of UN Food Systems Summit champion was because I was inspired by the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, who used his office to elevate food as a nexus issue with the words, "It's time to change how we produce and consume, including to reduce greenhouse emissions. Transforming food systems is crucial for delivering all the Sustainable Development Goals." Transformation was the word he used, and it's an essential concept. trade rules will be important in shaping those future food systems, in shaping that transformation. Food is a big deal. It's responsible for about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. It's the biggest single sector. Producing our food takes up half the habitable land surface of the planet. So it's the biggest user of land. And through industrial animal agriculture, it is a major driver of wildlife declines, of ecosystem collapse, and the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet. Despite food having such huge impact on all our futures, it has been strangely absent from so many key forums. Take climate talks, where food, particularly animal-sourced foods, barely gets a mention, despite the fact that the livestock sector is responsible for more greenhouse gases than the direct emissions of all the world's planes, trains, and cars put together. This Thursday's summit aims to address this absence, to awaken the world to the fact that we must all work together to transform food systems, and that includes trade. And not before time, because food systems are now risking and actually are busting planetary boundaries, risking widespread collapse of the natural world on which we all depend. Agriculture already dominates land use, as I've mentioned, yet 4/5 of agricultural land is devoted to livestock production, 4/5. And despite such a vast commitment of land, livestock products produce only 37% of humanity's protein and 1/5 of our calories. We're being shortchanged. It's hardly efficient, and there is limited room for growth. The livestock sector, driven by factory farming, is also a useful indicator of how the natural and man-made worlds are now out of balance. Taken together, the weight of humans and the animals we rear for food, the mammals we rear for food account for 96% of all mammals on Earth. Everything else, from elephants to badgers and mice, they add up to just 4%. And when it comes to birds, domestic poultry account for 70% of the mass of all the world's birds. It's a challenge we need to address head on. In a world producing 80 billion land animals for food every year, most of them factory farmed, resetting the balance will require switching to welfare positive, nature friendly production with fewer animals. The EU is well placed to lead on this crucial, urgent agenda. For trade to play its part in achieving the SDGs, it has to reinforce, not undermine, progress on climate, nature-friendly production, and animal welfare. The health of all of us is interconnected. Our futures are all intertwined. One health, one welfare. Protecting people means protecting animals too. And that means as much in the trade arena as anywhere else. Reineke, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you, Reineke, and welcome again to today's event to all of you. For today's discussion, we have with us a stellar panel of experts and decision makers. Ms. Claire Bury, Deputy Director General for Food Sustainability at the European Commission, Pascal Durham, Member of the European Parliament, Chris Sherwood, Chief Executive at the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and Maureen Santos, Policy Officer at FASE, the Federation of Organizations for Social and Educational Assistance in Brazil, who is connecting at 6 a.m. of Brazilian time. As you have heard from Reineke and Philippe, the case for action when it comes to address animal welfare is quite self-evident. It's about health, it's about the planet, but there's also an economic argument which is emerging today. So it is against this backdrop that this panel intends to explore together how countries handle trade partnership in a way that supports rather than hinder animal welfare and broader sustainability goals. The aim today is really to identify some new trends, some possible practices that we can learn from some of those countries. Let me turn to our first speaker, Claire Bury. You're Deputy Director General at the DG Health, in charge of European food policy, but also animal welfare. And you have extensive experience on this topic because in your DG, you're not only responsible for negotiating provisions on animal welfare, but also in implementing them. So you're also in contact with the reality on the ground. Claire, would you be able to tell us where do we stand today in this debate, and in particular, how animal welfare can be better addressed in trade agreements, focusing on the bilateral dimension for the time being?
So thanks very much, and good morning, Alberto. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Reinicke and Philippe, for those inspiring words at the beginning, and thanks to Eurogroup and the Good Lobby for organising this panel today. I think it's a great initiative in the light of the UN Food Systems Summit, which we've all been working on, I think, over the last few months. So we're hoping that there's really going to be some results this week. Yeah. But of course, Alberto, I think I'm happy to answer your question. I'd like to put it in the context, the overall context, which I think Philip was talking about as well, which is, for us, this is part of our work on the Farm to Fork strategy and the overall sustainability of food systems. So what we said in Farm to Fork was that we wanted to have a chapter on sustainable food systems in bilateral agreements, and the trade policy review picked up on that. So we are joined up on this in terms of what we're thinking about in DG Sante and DG Trade, and bringing our policies together. The idea of this chapter is to try and have closer cooperation with the partners so that we can promote the global transition towards sustainable food systems. I think we can say there are different approaches on that, but we're really trying now to bring as many partners on board as we possibly can to how we should go about transforming the whole food system all the way along the value chain. So this chapter that we propose to put into bilateral agreements should talk about the sustainability of food production, processing, food consumption, but also very much at the heart of that, of course, animal welfare, the fight against antimicrobial resistance, you referred to as well, Reinicke. We've tabled already a chapter for discussion in the negotiating rounds with Chile, New Zealand, Australia, and Indonesia. Maybe I can come back to the details of those afterwards. But I think what we want on animal welfare is a dedicated article which will promote further cooperation involving aspects such as exchange of information, but also research collaboration, development and implementation of relative standards. We really want to go, I would say we want to go up a step now. We've been doing this already. If you look back in some of the trade agreements, we've had provisions since around 2000, but now we're moving into another gear. We think that these provisions will help us to improve the animal welfare conditions in partner countries, but also it's important to us to understand what others are doing as we develop our own legislation. We are reviewing the animal welfare legislation. We know the Parliament is very active on this at the moment. We have the End the Cage Age petition. This is really, I think, a crucial moment in changing our legislation. So at that point, we want to be open to discuss with others. I think what's interesting is that, surprisingly, we've managed to get references in agreements, even in agreements with, for example, Asian countries, which have a very different approach from us. But as I say, I think now with the adoption of Farm to Fork, the chapter and the agreements, much more detail, a specific mention of animal welfare and how we will go into that. We really want to step up cooperation and make a big difference now in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. If I can, as a follow-up question, how this, let's say, new approach or more courageous approach by the EU is perceived by your trade partners? What has been the experience so far?
Well, I have to say the experience has been good. I think we've had traction on these issues in the past, but we're getting even more traction. We see that we've got an animal welfare article, as I was mentioning, with Chile, with Canada, with Japan, with Vietnam, Singapore, Korea, Mercosur, and also under negotiation with Australia, New Zealand, and Indonesia. This is really a very wide range of countries. We also have our association agreements, of course, with the Eastern European neighbours. So Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, which have what we call the approximation articles, where we're even, encouraging those countries to take on board the same legislation and the same approach that we have on SBS in general and animal welfare more specifically. The articles that we have talk about exchanging information. They talk about cooperation on animal welfare and research. It also talks about transport That's been one of the issues, I would say, over the last year. The European Parliament's been working, I'm sure Pascal's very well aware of that as well, on animal transport, coming up with a specific report on that, but also supporting improved implementation and having work programs on those different areas. So we have we set out a very concrete plan about what we want to do with the countries. It's not just a talking shop. It's really about implementing differences and making a change on animal welfare. So if I could just mention the CETA agreements, Canada, there I think we benefit from exchange of knowledge and expertise and science on animal welfare issues, and also exchanging best practices and approaches to animal welfare. We had a first initiative which focused on information sharing around a long distance animal transportation, which is now being completed. Good cooperation with Chile, yearly action plans under the agreement, and now I think that's led to an adoption in Chile, in fact, on a law on animal welfare. You mentioned Ukraine, Monica, and I heard what you said about chicken, but we do see that one result of the agreement with Ukraine has been that they have changed their legislation and they've adopted the relevant EU animal welfare rules with an enforcement deadline of 2026. Okay, that's some way in the future, but at least it gives us an objective to hold them to, and we can have staging posts along the way to that. And I'd also, I think just to finish there, I've mentioned New Zealand, where we've had an animal welfare forum since 2007, 2008. So this is really very long-standing cooperation. But I think what we see is that there is good traction with other countries. We are building up. Some of them we've had cooperation for a long time, but now we're making a breakthrough with other countries and really specific concrete plans about what we do with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire Bourry from the European Commission, for giving us a sense of how the Commission, how the EU as a whole is positioning itself on the issue in this particular time. Let's now turn to Chris Sherwood, CEO of the UK-based Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Chris, it's a great pleasure to have you here to hear the UK perspective, which has become over time a trade partner of the European Union. It is pretty clear by now that London as a trade agenda, as also a defense agenda. That's something we've learned of the last few hours. And as we have seen with Australia now is going fast. Can you please enlighten us from your perspective? What is the debate, if any at all, at the moment in the UK on addressing animal welfare in trade policy?
Well, good morning, Alberto, and thank you for the invite to participate today. And thank you to Reineke and Philip at Eurogroup and, of course, colleagues at the Good Lobby. It's a real pleasure to join you today, although the topic I've been asked to talk about is rather depressing, because I fear that the UK is becoming a case study about how a middle-tier country can struggle when it comes to preserving animal welfare standards whilst negotiating free trade deals. The context in the UK is that, we do have some of the highest farm welfare standards in the world. And we're also, we don't have food security. So we're a net importer of food products from around the world, and particularly with the EU. And on your question, Alberto, what this kind of topic is highlighted is a real tension at the heart of our government. On one hand, our government in its manifesto when elected in 2019 talked about having some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world, but that is rubbing up against desire to have a global Britain negotiating free trade deals around the world. And those two positions in the government are very hard to reconcile. And it's also bringing out tensions in the UK because we do have devolved governments. We have a separate government in Edinburgh, in Cardiff, and in Belfast. And farm welfare in free trade deals is becoming an issue with those different devolved governments. And there's real tension across the UK at the moment. We've now negotiated our first post-Brexit free trade deal with Australia, and we're some way down the track in a deal with New Zealand. And I think that those deals do reveal some real issues for the UK. Australia going into their negotiations had clear red lines around climate change and around their farm products. And in New Zealand, animal welfare has become a red line in their deal. Depressingly for the UK, it's unclear about what our red lines are, and our trade policy is not clear. It's one of the criticisms we have of the government about what their trade policy is, and it hasn't been published. So what we see in effect is our trade policy is to negotiate as many deals as possible with as many countries as possible to demonstrate that Brexit is a success for this government. And that is a concern because we have set a very worrying precedent around farm welfare standards in the free trade deal that's been negotiated with Australia, which does not fill us with confidence about how we will be in deals with the likes of the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, which are all in the offing. I think the third point from the UK example is the political reluctance to have a sensible deal with the European Union when it comes to farm animal welfare. You know, we would like to see equivalence, we'd like to see a common veterinary area, and I think there's political reluctance to do that because of the desire to make Brexit a success and not to tie the UK too closely to the European Union. And that is a matter of regret. We now see a situation where the likes of Switzerland and New Zealand have better access to EU markets than the UK does, despite the fact that we're only 30 miles from the coast of France. And I think the fourth point for me is that we do have an issue in the UK about lack of scrutiny. You know, this is a new set of activities that the Westminster Parliament is doing in overseeing trade policy. And we have a new department, the Department for International Trade. But we're in a situation where the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which was set up after an unprecedented campaign to bring greater scrutiny, has still not been formed on a permanent basis and not had the opportunity to scrutinise the free trade deal with Australia, which it should do. So that leads me to think that there is a desire to have a lack of scrutiny because the government is exposed on many areas. So to finish in my remarks, we're a worrying case study for how a country can struggle.
Oops, I can no longer hear Chris. We might have lost him at the end, but I think he was at the end of his remarks. He gave us a pretty sober picture of what it takes to become a case study for the inability of developing a trade policy capable enough to actually impose and export trade standards. Let me move now to Pascal Durham. Pascal, you're a prominent member of the European Parliament, also an animal welfare advocate, being also the co-founder of the French party Europe Écologie Les Verts. And we are thrilled to have you with us today because you have a lot of experience as an advocate within the European Parliament. First of all, I would like to ask you for a reaction to what we heard from Claire Bury earlier on regarding this welfare provision that the Commission is inserting, has been inserting in its own FTAs over the last few years. What is your take? What has been your experience on this over the last few years? Pascal.
Merci beaucoup, Alberto. Merci beaucoup de cette invitation et merci d'avoir accepté la traduction en français. Ça permet, de faire vivre la diversité culturelle européenne et de m'exprimer avec plus de facilité. Et donc, je vous en suis très reconnaissant. Écoutez, moi, j'aimerais, on va toujours essayer de démarrer par une note optimiste. La note optimiste, c'est que la question du bien-être animal devient une question, si ce n'est majeure, du moins récurrente, des accords commerciaux, des discussions, des attentes des consommateurs et de la vision que l'on peut avoir de l'avenir de l'alimentation et de sa durabilité. Ça, c'est la bonne nouvelle. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a encore quelques années, personne ne s'intéressait, ou presque, ni dans la classe politique, ni dans l'économie réelle, parce qu'évidemment, tout ça n'est pas sérieux. Personne ne s'intéressait vraiment à la question animale, qui était une question accessoire. Donc ça, c'est une bonne nouvelle. Et effectivement, ça a été dit, les choses évoluent, des enquêtes sont en cours, le Parlement essaye de faire bouger les lignes. Juste une réaction, mais elle n'est pas polémique, mais je me réjouis de voir que la Commission maintenant s'intéresse vraiment clairement à ce problème et est venue d'ailleurs le dire sur la question du transport des animaux, est venue le dire dans notre commission d'enquête parce que je n'ai pas oublié, c'est pas pour polémiquer, c'est juste pour dire que ça évolue bien. Je n'ai pas oublié à l'intergroupe animal il y a 2-3 ans, quand on avait voulu mettre en place cette commission d'enquête, la Commission nous avait expliqué qu'en réalité, tout allait très bien, qu'il n'y avait pas de retour d'expériences négatives et que globalement, 99,9% du transport des animaux se déroulait au sein de l'Union européenne sans trop de difficultés. Bien. Depuis, les choses ont évolué et c'est une excellente chose parce qu'effectivement, on ne peut pas régler une question si déjà on considère qu'elle n'existe pas. Donc, oui, il y a des difficultés et oui, maintenant, on est en train d'avancer. Après, moi, j'ai toujours un problème, évidemment. Ne soyons pas naïfs. La définition du bien-être animal n'est certainement pas la même pour l'intergroupe animal, pour un certain nombre d'ONG et de défenseurs de la cause animale, que celle que peut avoir un industriel de l'agroalimentaire. C'est-à-dire que nous considérons, et je le dis au nom d'une grande partie des députés européens, mais pas que, nous considérons par exemple que certaines formes d'élevage industriel sont incompatibles avec le bien-être animal. Certaines formes d'abattage des animaux sont incompatibles avec le bien-être animal. Certaines formes de transport des animaux sont incompatibles avec le bien-être animal. Donc, tant qu'on n'aura pas réussi à définir précisément ce que nous entendons par le mot bien-être animal, alors nous aurons toujours des difficultés. Ça, c'est la première des difficultés, c'est arriver à trouver des définitions partagées et conjointes. Et la grande initiative End of the Cage et le fait que la société civile et des ONG se soient mobilisées justement pour essayer de mettre un terme, de dénoncer d'abord, mais de mettre un terme à l'exploitation en cage, notamment de la volaille, des lapins, etc., est un grand progrès sur ce que l'on peut normer et définir. Donc ça, c'est une première chose. La deuxième chose, c'est que nous sommes confrontés à la difficulté de mise en œuvre des règles. C'est-à-dire qu'il ne suffit pas aussi de dire dans nos accords commerciaux, nous considérons que le bien-être animal, enfin je veux dire, je peux vous donner des exemples dans un autre domaine qui est celui des droits humains. Il n'y a pas un accord de libre-échange européen qui ne vise pas la question du respect des droits humains. Je serais curieux que l'on puisse prendre la cartographie de la planète et regarder tous les pays avec lesquels nous avons des accords, si effectivement les droits humains y sont totalement respectés. Donc on sait que non. Donc il va y avoir la question, il n'y a pas simplement la clause, il y a la question quels moyens l'Union européenne va se donner, et notamment économiquement, humainement, pour contrôler le fait que le bien-être animal est respecté dans les pays avec lesquels nous avons des libres-échanges. Je vais prendre l'exemple classique du Brésil, puisque nous allons avoir une intervenante brésilienne tout à l'heure. Au Brésil, pour le moment, les défenseurs de la nature risquent leur vie. Il y a des morts tous les jours pour ceux qui essayent de lutter contre la déforestation, pour ceux qui essayent de défendre une vision durable à la fois de la forêt et de l'élevage au sens large, et qui défendent les populations autochtones, ils en meurent. Donc moi je serais curieux de savoir comment l'Union européenne demain va imposer à Bolsonaro et son administration le respect de règles, même celles qui figurent dans des accords commerciaux. Donc moi, je fais partie des gens qui considèrent qu'en l'état, le Mercosur doit être arrêté, bloqué, et que nous devons faire en sorte, effectivement, de veiller à ce que n'entrent pas sur le territoire européen des produits qui sont issus à la fois de l'exploitation animale et, j'allais dire, au-delà de l'exploitation de la biodiversité et des humains. Parce que le soja transgénique qu'on importe de manière considérable en Europe pour pouvoir nourrir nos animaux d'élevage, ce soja détruit la planète et détruit les habitats autochtones de manière absolument scandaleuse. Donc voilà, il faut qu'on arrive à trouver cet équilibre. Ça a été dit tout à l'heure, je ne reviendrai pas là-dessus. Les questions agricoles, les questions d'élevage sont systématiquement, alors on m'a dit bizarrement, ne soyons pas naïfs, on sait très bien pourquoi, sont systématiquement écartées des grands débats, des grands sommets. Donc c'est très bien que l'ONU et d'autres organismes, et l'Union européenne évidemment, se saisissent de cette question-là, qui reste une question majeure, mais difficile.
Thank you, Pascal. And in the meantime, I see Chris is back with us to condense what Pascal said. Is optimistic because animal welfare is on the agenda, is on the political agenda, both at the European and at the global level. So there's some political will, at least rhetorically, to address it. It is a reality in many trade agreements driven by the European Commission insistence. But the question remains the implementation issue, something that we see across the board. Also, when it comes to human rights clauses, what is the real implementation? How we can provide teeth to those agreements? I think this is an open question. We might want to hear from Per Bourrier for the Commission on the reality on the ground. But now let me move to our next speaker, who is Maureen Santos, who is connecting from Brazil this morning. You are a policy officer at FASE, so at the Federation of Organization for Social and Education Assistance in Rio, and you have previously served as a program coordinator for environmental and social justice in the office of the Irish Ball Foundation in Brazil. So you are, in a way, a witness of what the EU is trying to do and to achieve when it comes to animal welfare in its own trade agreements. Many people think or argue that the EU is exercising some form of regulatory colonialism. So a colleague of mine called this the Brussels effect. How do you perceive this? What could the EU push for that to actually happen and to be helpful to Brazilian society increasingly concerned about animal welfare standards? Maureen, to you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thanks, Good Lobby and all the organizers for the invitation. Yeah, it's very early here, so I apologize if you make some mistakes talking. My presentations goes forward towards, I think you keep talking what the main issue that the former speakers talk about, how trade agreements help to promote, in the case of European Union, European Mercosur agreement, a worsening sustainable food system. Because right now what we realize, it's using the case of this European Union Mercosur agreement, we can see and we can talk about the impacts of the trade policies on agri-food system, industrial intensive farming, and you see that is always detrimental to animal welfare and contributing to deforestation. As he said also, specifically in the case of Brazil, you base it on this kind of model. As I have a very short time, I also would like to talk about the risks of the private capture of the food system, but I don't know if I have enough time to talk both, so maybe in the debate. What you can see right now, studying the European Union Mercosur agreement, is that the provision of this FTA conflict with ambitious climate action. The agreement, if ratified, would result in increasing of the European Union imports, that specifically in primary agricultural commodities from the Mercosur countries, from a region that's very critical to maintain a global biodiversity and also to regulate the climate. We saw that this complex agro-industrial in Mercosur region is destroying not only the Amazon forest, but also the Gran Chaco and the Cerrado regions. That's a very important regions to keep the global biodiversity. There is a number of studies that show that if the agreement is ratified, you can have also the possibility of the increase of the greenhouse gas emissions, undermining the global goals that the NDCs that will be implemented in the mark of the Paris Agreement. We know that a quarter of European Union food supply emissions were imported from Latin America. Agricultural goods accounted for half of EU imports from Mercosur countries in 2018. So we believe that this agreement also would expand trading by increasing European quotas for beef, poultry, pork, sugar, ethanol, rice, honey, and sweet corn. If you take like the list of the quotas, because you have the lists of the zero, they eliminate the tariffs, but you will have this quota lists that the agreement can open. They create new incentives for exports, and this can result in also the land use change. We have, for example, for a beef quota, we increase by 50% related to what we have right now between these two regions. Poultry, we increase 55%. But the bigger one, it's very scary number, it's related to the sugar cane, because the ethanol will increase 540% of the quota that we have right now. in comparison to this present. So all those this data can show us that it's a very complicated agreement, because they can also create supporting this actual development model of that's in Brazil and in the other regions of Mercosur, is creating all this process of deforestation, and now is related also with the step back of our legal framework on environment. If you can see in everything that the Brazilian parliament is doing and in other countries of Mercosur to flexibilize our legislation, environmental legislation, it's very connected to attend what this trade agreement and also other agreements that this region is negotiating, you can have. So in this case, I don't have more time. We really think that a Mercosur agreement needs to be stopped, and we need more time to discuss also these provisions and these impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, for providing this perspective from the ground with a lot of figures on the actual impact and raising issue in relation to the implementation of many provisions. Let me ask now to Pascal Durham a reaction, because Pascal comes from the very same country, which is France, where there's been a major debate on the conclusion of the EU-Mercosur agreement, with the president himself being opposed to the agreement as it stands, and this also influencing somehow the European Parliament. Can you tell us how do we stand on this, Pascal? Why such an agreement, which follows a pretty classical model of European FTA, is so problematic for animals and for the transition towards a sustainable food system?
Alberto, j'aimerais être là aussi optimiste et vous dire que c'est parce que le président de la République française a considéré que la question du bien-être animal devenait la question majeure des accords commerciaux dans le monde et que la France ne pouvait plus signer un tel accord. J'aimerais pouvoir vous dire cela. J'en suis pas totalement persuadé, même s'il y a peut-être une part de vérité dedans. Non, je crois que s'il y a le blocage en France, parce que c'est un blocage assez fort à l'égard du Mercosur, il semblerait qu'il y ait une grande partie de la classe politique française qui, en l'état, soit opposée à la signature du Mercosur et le revendique, le dit publiquement. Je pense que c'est un peu lié aussi aux caractéristiques historiques de l'élevage français et au fait qu'un grand nombre d'éleveurs français, et donc le représentant syndical majoritaire en France, qui est la FNSEA, qui a un poids extrêmement important, considère qu'il y a un danger majeur à ouvrir les frontières de l'Union européenne largement à une concurrence de l'élevage industriel. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas à la fois, et ça c'est une question de cohérence aussi de l'Union européenne, on ne peut pas à la fois demander à nos éleveurs de partir dans des transitions durables, d'arrêter les logiques d'industrialisation à outrance, d'arrêter l'importation de soja transgénique et de se remettre à cultiver des protéines en Europe. On ne peut pas à la fois leur demander ces efforts qui évidemment entraînent des investissements, entraînent des choix de culture et d'élevage, et en même temps, au même moment, importer de la viande qui est produite dans des conditions qui n'ont rien à voir. C'est vrai pour le Mercosur, mais moi je ne me focalise pas sur le Mercosur. Je me focalise un peu plus sur le Mercosur à cause de quelqu'un comme le président Bolsonaro, que je considère comme un danger absolu, bien au-delà encore de ce que pouvait être Trump, et c'est pas peu dire. Donc nous avons effectivement un rapport particulier là. Mais on pourrait avoir cette discussion même avec le Brésil de Lula, et on l'avait déjà, c'est-à-dire que comment est-ce qu'on peut à la fois protéger les populations locales, les populations autochtones, la forêt amazonienne, qui est un patrimoine absolu mondial de l'humanité, et en même temps faire en sorte qu'un élevage se développe. Voilà, donc le sujet que nous avons, et la question que tu poses, Alberto, est une question en fait véritablement de fond. C'est-à-dire qu'il ne suffit pas, et ça, moi j'ai un problème en France avec ça, il ne suffit pas de dire on arrête le Mercosur pour que les choses soient résolues. Par exemple, le soja transgénique brésilien qui déforeste là, maintenant, aujourd'hui, la forêt amazonienne est importé dans l'Union européenne. Les animaux, les vaches françaises sont nourries avec des granulés de soja importés du Brésil. Donc la réalité, il ne suffit pas de dire on va s'opposer. Et en cela, je peux comprendre d'ailleurs ce que dit la Commission quand elle dit qu'il vaut mieux des accords qui prévoient des clauses nouvelles et qui sont appliquées plutôt que de laisser la situation perdurer comme elle l'est actuellement si elle n'est pas bonne. Donc nous avons beaucoup à faire sur cette question-là. Le fait que la France, grand producteur agricole, dise à un moment non, il faut tout remettre à plat est une excellente chose. Pour autant, si on ne change pas notre modèle, si on ne se donne pas les moyens, et je le répète par exemple, de cultiver les protéines chez nous, rien ne se passera réellement dans la pratique, tout simplement parce qu'il faut continuer à nourrir nos animaux d'élevage. Ou alors, il faut réduire aussi l'élevage. Mais si c'est le cas, eh bien, ça nécessite des investissements et un accompagnement des agriculteurs. Voilà, donc globalement, la situation est bonne dans le sens où on la pose maintenant, mais pour autant, on n'a pas encore résolu les problèmes. Et en l'état, le soja transgénique lié à la déforestation est importé dans l'Union européenne.
Thank you, Pascal, for addressing this question and actually highlighting this tension between the species schizophrenia that we all have at the European level, where we basically ask and expect our own breeders and farmers to transition to new modes at the same time, opening and exposing them to competition that in reality is following different rules of the game. I think this is the question that one of the participants, Anne Bonesh, is asking. She's saying, in the civil dialogue groups on animal products at the European Commission, I note that the objectives remain the same: find market access for exports, promote production, reduce legal constraints. How can the European Commission become coherent on animal welfare and environmental climate urgent policy? Claire, to you.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. The hot potato now. Maybe just to go back to what Pascal was saying before about, are the clauses enough? Is the dialogue the way to go about it, etc. I mean, I think obviously in the EU, that's our starting point, no? Which is we dialogue, we discuss, we don't foist our standards on everybody else. That's not our way of doing things. So that's why we put the clauses in the agreements. We're trying to make them more specific. We're trying to have a more detailed cooperation. We also, of course, have to respect the international standards. I mean, Pascal, you would be the first one, I think, to say that we have to respect the WTO, we have to respect the International Organization for Animals, etc., because we are multilateralists, and that's the way that we do things. We bound ourselves to these rules. So sure, and that's always our starting point. But on the other hand, it's right that with things like the Ending the Cage initiative, our review of the animal welfare legislation, we are raising standards. We are making life more challenging for our farmers, for those who are involved in breeding animals, raising animals, looking after animals. We are increasing the standards for them. And in response, I just want to say, I mean, Pascal, you're right that things have changed, I think, in terms of animal welfare over the last few years. And in response to the End the Cage initiative, the Commission was very clear. It said, we propose to phase out and finally prohibit the use of such cages for all these species and categories: laying hens, rabbits, pullets, broiler breeders, sows, a number of cows, and so on, calves, under conditions, of course, subject to a transitional period. It's not the kind of thing we can do overnight. I think we agree that. And it has to, of course, be informed by science. We have to get an input from EFSA. And we also have to do the proper impact assessment. So the Commission is making a very big commitment there. And we are going to raise standards within the EU. Now, what is the consequence of that in terms of trade? Well, if you look at the Commission's communication on End the Cage age, there we're very clear. We say there are different options now in terms of what we can do on this. We could do the enhanced cooperation with trading partners, which is what we're doing, but improve on that even further. Option 2, we could impose some EU rules on imports, which already is going quite a long way. And we have to do that in a way which is compatible with WTO, and we will have to give assistance when we do it. But we're also maybe talking about having an animal welfare labeling system that would apply to imports. So I would say the Commission is very much aware of the concerns. We are listening to those who have concerns about farm to fork. We're listening to the challenges that they will have. And we are also thinking about what the consequences should be in terms of our international trade policy. And I think that We have to be very practical about that, and we have to think of measures, and we have to put in place measures that will ensure that there is a level playing field for our farmers when we make these changes in a way which complies with our international obligations. We are multilateralists, and we have to do it that way. We have to discuss, we have to explain, but we do have to take the consequences into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for this this response to the hot potato. We got a question which I think is a good follow-up here from Copper Pigot, who said, Pascal has said we cannot expect farmers to change their product and processes as it will require investment, major investment from them that might not necessarily be possible today. What can be done to keep production and value for the farmers high or improve it for them while still improving animal welfare? Perhaps, Chris, what would be your perspective, your take on this, to be really pragmatic on how to get this right?
Thanks very much for the question, Alberto. I mean, it's a really interesting question because actually it is quite relevant to what's happening here in the UK. And I think there are two ways to sort of think about this. You know, I've given quite a pessimistic assessment around the impact of Brexit on our free trade policy. But there are some opportunities that we are seeing there, and there is a current debate in the UK about our subsidy regime moving forward. And we've obviously had subsidies for environmental impact for farmers, and the government has been consulting around subsidies for improvements around farm animal welfare. So that is one lever the government can use. But on the import side, that is where our concerns do come to the fore. And I think the challenge that we're going to see in the UK moving forward is the potential for imports of animal products coming into the UK that would not be permitted to be produced to that standard in the UK, undercutting our farmers. And at the moment, you know, the farmers' movement in the UK and animal protection groups are quite aligned because we want to protect those standards. But there is the risk in the future that the farmers kind of move away from the high standards and want to see greater deregulation. So for me, there are two policy tools that we've got here. There's the lever of subsidies that obviously the government is investing significant resources in the farming industry and using those to promote higher welfare. And then the second tool is preventing imports. I think the third part of it is consumer awareness. And I'm pleased to see Claire talk about labelling within the EU. You know, we have a consultation that's just been launched in the UK to improve labelling on animal products. That's something that the RSPCA has wanted to see. We've seen the impact of that on egg production in the UK, the move away from caged hens to free range and other sources in terms of eggs. So we see the potential around labelling. So consumer awareness is important, and the RSPCA runs the biggest welfare-based certification scheme, which we've just done a review of, called RSPCA Assured as well. So I think there is real potential around raising consumer awareness. While I have the floor, Alberto, I think the other challenge for us here, you know, and I was really inspired by what Reineke said earlier, is our critics label us as protectionist. And I think we really have to tackle that argument head on. We're not protectionist. What we want to see is, you know, groups like the EU, like the UK, promote our standards. You know, we need to be evangelists and exporters of those standards around the world and tackle that protectionist argument head on, because it's what our critics who have a vested interest in the status quo and a race to the bottom want to see. We need to tackle that head on because it's not about protection, it's about promotion, in my view.
Thank you, Chris. Maureen, to you. You wanted to touch this point and now it's coming back to you. How much protectionism do you see from your perspective in this attempt by countries, jurisdictions like the EU and the UK to raise the standards and to impose those standards in a way or in another? What's your take based on your experience?
For me, there is like two tracks. There is one track that's it's high these standards, and like the debate about CBAM in the European Union. It's a kind of, as some countries like in the Latin America region can see, the carbon measures adjustment orders. They can see this as a standard that we compromise and you'll be like a kind of protectionism, environmental protectionism, climate protectionism for these countries. But on the other side, we see again, we bring back the example of the European Mercosur agreement. We see that some kinds of the standards is not included in the agreement. When you saw the chapter on the phytosanitaries, the MSF measures, they don't include very strongly the precaution principle. And this for us is a very complicated, because at the same time you have very high standards in European Union, and you don't have the same standards in Brazil. And we are seeing right now a process of the regulation of our standards. So in this case, we can generate a kind of double standard related to the kind of products that we produce it to import, to send, to export for these regions, and the bad quality products that stay in the countries, that was being produced. So I think I see these two processes. This is one of the criticized that you said, because as you have so high standards in European Union, how you not bring these standards also to the agreement, so you can push up the legislation of the countries who are negotiating, not keep down, I don't know if you
Thank you, Maureen. Well, the double standard issue is something that resonates within the European Union, because we have been facing a couple of crises where European central countries were actually raising this issue against the private operators, actually sometimes engaging into this conversation. Among the speakers, who would like to address the double standard argument? I don't know, Pascal or Claire would like to tackle this risk of seeing the European Union nudging, leading a third country to actually develop this kind of double standards. Is empirically grounded, this risk? Okay, nobody wants to take this. Chris, do you have a take on this?
I mean, just coming in on the question that Juan has raised as well about how the EU operates with third-party countries. I mean, the EU is one of the three principal trading groupings in the world after the United States and China, and it does have that power to be able to make demands and red lines in trade agreements around the globe. And of course, it takes the EU quite a while to do that, given that it's negotiating with 26, 27 different countries. But that trading power is important. It goes back to my point about promoting standards rather than seeing it as a protectionist. So, for me, that's an important facet of the EU. And I see that difficulty for the UK as a nation of 65 million people trying to negotiate preferential access for our products in other markets, and also setting standards and equivalents and trade barriers with other nations as well. It's much harder to do that. So I think that's something that's actually a positive thing, because we do have our values and principles here in Europe, and we want to see those enshrined in free trade deals, whether that's about animal protection, whether that's about environmental standards, whether that's about recognition of trade unions or workers' rights. They're important parts of what can be achieved with the EU. And the UK is showing the challenges of doing that as a middle-ranking country.
Thank you, Chris, for your tweet on this. It's going to be your final tweet. I'm going to ask all the other speakers to do the same. What are your expectations vis-a-vis the United Nations Food Systems Summit? What's next? You have 60 seconds instead of a few hundred words. Claire.
So, Alberto, from UN Food Systems Summit, I'm looking forward to some really concrete results this time around, in particular on areas like food loss and waste. I see that as being one of the areas where I think there's a growing consensus that we need to act. I think it could bring together countries which have different approaches. So I would really hope that that's going to be one of the alliances that will come out of the summit, and that the EU can make a very specific and concrete contribution to that.
Thank you, Claire. Pascal?
Mon résumé, ça serait que l'on comprenne que le modèle dans lequel la planète s'est lancée, de destruction du vivant, de destruction de ses forêts, de surexploitation industrielle des animaux, est un modèle qui n'est pas durable, qui n'est pas viable, ni pour l'humanité au sens humain, ni pour les animaux, et que donc il faut que l'on se donne les moyens tous ensemble de modifier ce système et que l'on aide de manière claire, et ça n'est effectivement pas du protectionnisme. Quand on a décidé d'arrêter de faire travailler les enfants dans les mines ou l'esclavage, ça n'était pas du protectionnisme, c'était tout simplement de l'avancée de conscience. Eh bien, il faut qu'on arrive à avoir le même rapport avec le vivant sous toutes ses formes, et donc j'attends que la prise de conscience soit forte en ce sens. Ensuite, on déclinera les politiques.
Merci Pascal. Maureen, your tweet, your final one.
Just to finish, because I didn't have time to talk about the food system, but if you take also the food system debate and the relation this to the international trade, we really have to think about that this kind of solutions is not really going to a good place, you know. So we really need real solutions to overcome this global crisis, this global food crisis, that can be based on the needs of the small-scale farmers, the indigenous people, the traditional communities, the fisher folks, pastoralists, and to move us towards the food sovereignty. Because this kind of concept, just transition, food sovereignty, climate justice, this didn't appear in the debate. No, so we from the big part of Brazilian civil society and also the Latin America, we really think this kind of principle have to be included in this debate, because only for that we can bring this debate and the proposals of alternatives also in the transition for a more compatible with the available resources and with the protection of biodiversity and animal welfare, and to combat climate change. We don't believe that the future is can be detected by the same also corporations and the same practices that was the very source of the problem. So I think this debate is very, very important, because we really need to connect how this food system summit is being implemented and being prepared to this trade agreement that we saw, because right now we didn't see too much good solution that can come from this kind of process.
Thank you, Maureen. We are coming to an end. I think we had quite an interesting picture of what the situation ahead of the summit. I feel that there is hope that the summit itself will lead to a great reckoning of the insustainability of our economic model that still drives the agro-food business and all the many unintended consequences. But the hope obviously is that this might lead to some holistic actions, not only sectorial one, and it's pretty clear that this was one of the messages we have gathered today. So please join me in thanking all the panelists with us today: Claire Moury from the European Commission, Pascal Durham from the European Parliament, Maureen Santos from Brazil very early this morning, and Chris Sherwood from the UK perspective. Stay with us. In a few minutes, we are going to kick off with the second panel, looking this time at animal welfare and trade from a more multilateral and global perspective. Thank you again, and please stay in touch with all of us, both at Eurogroup for Animals and also at the Good Lobby, for more follow-up and a recording of the video of today. Thank you. So much for joining us for this second panel. Thank you to you participants also for returning or staying with us. We're going to build on this initial panel, but now we're going to turn to another group of experts, speaker, to discuss the multilateral dimension of trade and animal welfare. We're going to be looking at some WTO issues. We're going to be looking also at the global value chains, which are also part of the picture, and how addressing animal welfare at this level can also help or contribute to transition toward sustainable food systems. So let me introduce you to Jean-Marie Pogam, Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization, Professor Laura Nielsen, who specializes in international trade law. I still remember reading her PhD probably 15, 16 years ago as a pioneer working on animal welfare at the WTO level and looking at non-trade concern. Ignacio Bercero, Director General for Trade at the European Commission. Cés Jan Hollander, Global Farming Expert Manager at Danone. Okay, so when it comes to the global level, I think the discussion about integrating animal welfare concerns into trade policy, it becomes even more complex than at the bilateral level. As of today, an egg coming from a cage bird is basically the same as one coming from a free-range farm, at least according to the current trade rules. And the production method distinction has been with us for a long time, and this limited certainty on whether you can consider that two products are different based on methods of production that are invisible in the final product remains with us. So we're going to try to tackle these issues. We're going to try to explore whether and why trade should be better in advancing animal welfare, or at least putting it under its own radar screen. At the moment, we don't see in our dominant economic system an effort at having prices that somehow incorporate the social cost of many of the externalities produced to the planet. And I think this is certainly one of the issues, the lack of observability of those realities. Without any further ado, let me turn to Jean-Marie Pogam. You are Deputy Director General of WTO, in charge inter alia of environmental issues. And we are all witnessing, after a few years of stalemate, that the WTO seems to be moving forward. And I think many of us are really happy about this potential bounce back of the multilateral trade regime. With the new DG, Ngozi Vera, there's been much more focus on trade and sustainable development goals. And the organization itself is undergoing a modernization process where it would certainly be important to look at how trade can better support the achievement of the SDGs and the transition to sustainable food system. I think the global challenges the planet is facing, biodiversity, climate crisis, antimicrobial resistance, zoonoses, are very much linked to the way we produce products. And I would say amid the COVID pandemic, there's certainly much more public awareness about the interconnectedness of those issues and the need to address them at the multilateral level. Given your expertise and experience with many turning issues, how do you view the current state of play of the debate at the WTO on the need to take into account trade, animal welfare, but also methods of production? To you.
Well, thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me apologize. I was not aware that I could speak in French, which would have been much easier. So I prepare a little bit in English, but I'll be happy to interact in my native language later on if needed. It's a pleasure to join you ahead of this United Nations Food System Summit and to dig into the matter of animal welfare. I must say that at the WTO, we are not as advanced as you are in the European Union on the topic of animal welfare, which is only natural since, I mean, the WTO is global, so the preferences and value are not exactly even or as integrated as they are in the EU. But nevertheless, the WTO is familiar with animal welfare. And actually, the preparation of this discussion was for me an opportunity to dig into the matter, which I did not know so well. I'm not sure that I know it very well now, but I think I have improved in coming to you. And what I'd like to say is three things. The first one is that the concept of animal welfare, while not being defined by the textbook of the WTO, is absolutely recognized, since we have several agreements which directly or indirectly contain specific rules which explicitly refer to animal welfare, or more indirectly open a pathway toward it, in particular through the protection of animal health. So we have those texts inside the WTO, namely for, you are a professor of law, so you'll be familiar with the GATT, the trade and the obstacle to trade agreement, TBT, or the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, SPS. So these agreements explicitly mention the protection of animal life or health, the protection of environment and conservation of resources, and also our rules more generally recognize that some trade measures can be based on societal moral or ethical values or public morals and the TBT agreement, which is more the trade obstacle to trade, technical obstacle to trade agreement, which is the most important in that case for that topic, refers explicitly to the protection of animal or plant life or health and the protection of environment. So it's not an unknown concept from our textbook. Outside the WTO, outside the text of the WTO, there are all the standard setting organizations, such as the World Health Organization, OIE, or also ISO, which have explicit references to, and even more explicit references to animal welfare. For instance, the OIE defines animal welfare as, quote, the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the condition in which it lives and dies. And what is interesting is that the WTO encourages its members to explicitly base their trade policy measures on such international standard developed in those organizations. So my central message here is that the WTO will have no problem and will recognize the value and importance of animal welfare in an international trade, as long, of course, as you know the rule of the game, as long as it does not become a pretext for unjustifiable trade protection or disguised protectionism. In other words, as long as countries act in good faith. And so how do we evaluate this good faith? One way in the past has been litigation, trade dispute, where those concepts have been called in our discussion. And the experience that we have is based on several landmark disputes where animal welfare was raised as a major issue. Three of them were more about the environment, about the protection of endangered species, rather than directly animal welfare, but still they have an important meaning for it. These were the cases which are famous to environmental people dealing with trade of US shrimp turtle, US tuna dolphin, which have been developed in two cases. And the last one, which directly involved the EU, was absolutely centered on animal welfare. What did we learn with the US cases? Basically it was the US have been prohibited or taking other measures regulating the import of shrimp and shrimp products that were killing turtle. And they imposed also a requirement on the use of dolphin-safe labels on imports of tuna. That was a trade measure which was being discussed. And in those cases, the WTO ruling focused mostly on production processes, which you were mentioning at the beginning, that should not harm endangered or targeted species. And what, in a nutshell, was very significant is that the WTO ultimately allowed the US to restrict or otherwise regulate shrimp and tuna imports based on their production processes and not on the products themselves, as long as the requirement made environmental sense and could be justified. So these findings became quite relevant to provide more clarity on the matter of the product versus process, a topic that you have been taking. Finally, animal welfare was directly featuring center stage in the WTO ruling on the EC and seal products case, which is the fourth and the most recent one. This case was historical because it was the first time that animal welfare was discussed as a public moral issue in a WTO context. You remember that there was a general ban from the EU on the importation and marketing of seal products in response to the European public opinion indignation facing the inhuman killing of seals. The WTO appellate body agreed that the EU the EU seal regime was necessary to protect public morals. It was, however, found technically in breach of WTO obligation because it treated differently different Inuit populations, allowing some to sell their products and some not to sell their products. So you can capitalize on this case to understand that first, it was a major moment for the WTO to acknowledge that animal welfare was a very serious matter and a legitimate objective and a concern of importance for international trade. And at the same time, you could see that it was not really the if or the why, it was the how you implement trade measures to achieve such a legitimate objective. And what is always at stake in the WTO is not so much a principle of having values higher than trade on environment and health, but how you implement those values without discriminating. And this is maybe one area where there is a need for more discussions. My last point would be, I don't know how much time I have still, but my last point would be to illustrate a little bit of the dynamic of, I just gave you the state of play. The dynamic is really interesting because we can see that there is an increasing interest for animal welfare within our members. Not to say that animal welfare is the big issue of the WTO today, it is not, but it's a growing issue. And we have a proxy to see that is a notification of technical regulation. We have had over 100 for the last 10 years, which is not a lot. But what is interesting is that 50% of them came in the last 4 years. So that means that our members are more and more resorting to trade measures to try to deal with this issue of animal welfare. I will not comment on the content of this measure for the sake of time, but they relate to animal transportation and conditions of killing. One important feature is that 75% of the measures which are being notified to us come from developed countries. And when you see at what happens on the side of developing country, we see that the concern remains quite different. It's more centered on meeting the requirements on animal health than trying to promote animal welfare. It's more a market access standard of health requirement that the developing countries have in mind. So we observe that, for instance, through our, we have one lever, we have one tool of technical assistant, which is a fund where the WTO is contributing. It's a global fund called STDF, which helps developing countries meet the standards of sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. So this is, for instance, one tool where which could be integrated to integrate as part of the health standard and the promotion of objective health, meeting requirements and objective health standard. The animal welfare component could be also integrated. This brings me, I'll just stop there saying that the debate can absolutely be open and the WTO is a forum for this to support trade policy as enhancing an animal welfare.
Thank you for giving us the big picture coming from the genesis of how those treaties have been actually written and then interpreted over time. Let me turn briefly to Laura Nielsen, who has been spending a few years analyzing very closely the case law of the WTO dispute settlement system over the years, and to perhaps complete the picture by giving us a sense of this transition or the transformation that has occurred, how non-trade concerns got their way into the sensibilities also of the panelists or members of the appellate body, and where do you see we stand today? Laura.
Thank you. And thank you very much for this brief introduction into the case law. It's very useful in this panel. I see it as there has been a major development, as also been described, and we now have a recognition and an understanding of that animal welfare is something inherently different than environmental and climate change concerns. But I also see that the way that we still discuss this is that there are unilateral measures. Another country might disagree, bring a case, and then we litigate. And when I get the floor at the very end, I'm going to suggest a different way of doing this, because I don't think this is going to really fix the problem. Thank you.
Okay, we're all curious to see your perspective or how you're going to flip the conversation. Let me give the chance now to Ignacio Bercero Garcia, who was a director in charge of multilateral affairs, strategy, analysis, and evaluation at DG Trade in the Commission, has been acting also as a chief negotiator for the EU in multiple key trade negotiations, and is also a major WTO practitioner. Ignacio, we're thrilled to have you here today. There seems to be real momentum now, as we just heard also from the WTO itself, to discuss issues like climate change, deforestation, and different kind of non-trade concern. And the EU is certainly at the forefront of this effort, leading also an initiative on trade and environment with around 20 other countries. How do you see discussions on methods of production in that particular context? How this is evolving, if at all?
No, thank you, Alberto. And I have to say, I'm really intrigued with what Laura just said, because I'm very curious to see what she has to say, how we get out of the dynamic of discussing this issue purely in the context of litigation. And I think Jean-Marie has been very useful in terms of presenting a little bit the overall picture. Now, what I would like to do in my presentation is to give you a few considerations more broadly about what are the issues that you need to look into before you decide whether to apply a PPM-related measure to imported products. Now, PPM is a little bit of a technical term that we use a lot, trade lawyers, but basically we are talking about cases in which the production of a product creates a concern, but that the product itself, when it is put in the market, does not create negative externalities. Those are the type of situations in which if you apply a measure to an imported product, inevitably what you are going to be doing is looking primarily about the way in which the product has been produced outside your jurisdiction. And what I think has been very interesting in the evolution of our WTO law over the last 25 years, how we have moved from a very rigid position, which was basically saying PPM-related restrictions on imports are illegal, almost per se. I mean, if you actually look into the first tuna dolphin case in the days of the GATT, that was basically the state of the law at that point in time, and how through 25 years of jurisprudence, and I would say, particularly through the impact of the appellate body, we have got into a much more nuanced position. Now, I think, however, it would be a bit of a mistake to think that we have moved all the way towards the view that it is perfectly fine to apply a PPM-related requirement to imported products, because sometimes you hear that in the debate, we are imposing this requirement on our domestic producers. So, of course, imported products have to comply with the same requirements. And I would say that is also certainly a wrong perspective. I think the reality of the issue is somewhere in between. And we need to be aware that still, whenever you're actually considering an PPM-related import restriction, these tend to be highly controversial. There tends to be a high risk that you would actually get involved in WTO litigation. And WTO litigation has economic and political costs attached to it. Even when you consider that you have won a case, and I think one could argue that we came out quite nicely out of the disputes concerning the SEALS case, it was still a huge effort, not only in the litigation, but also in changing our legislation to comply with the WTO ruling. So what are the type of issues that I think as a policymaker you need to look into before you decide whether or not it is appropriate to require that imported products conform with PPM-related requirements? Now, the first one, I think, is going to be extremely important, that you can justify your measure on legitimate non-economic concerns, and that you can show very clearly that the measure is not tainted by economic or level playing field considerations. The more that there is actually evidence that a primary or significant motivation of the measure has been to ensuring that it's a level playing field, responding to economic concerns about the impact that the measure has on your domestic producers, the more that that element is significant, the more that there is a serious risk that when you actually get into WTO litigation, you will find that it is considered that it entails de facto discrimination first, and that then it is a disguised restriction on trade under the chapter of Article 20. So being able to show that the measure which is being taken is clearly guided by non-economic public policy concerns, I think is a first critical element. Now, the second one is that the more that you can actually show that the measure that you are taking, it is grounded in the response to global concerns, it is related to international norms, the more that it is going to be more easier to justify that it is legitimate for you to take an action on imported products. I say that because, of course, we are discussing today animal welfare, but as has been also pointed out, there's a number of important initiatives that the European Union has taken or it is considering, like the CBAM, which has been mentioned, which is clearly a response to a global concern, legislation which is on preparation to deal with deforestation, which again is clearly a global concern, or legislation to deal with the question of forced labor, which again, it is both global and based on international norms. So the more that you can actually argue that the action that you are taking is not purely based on a domestic consideration, but in response to concerns which have been legitimately accepted by the international community as being an issue of global concern, the more that you would actually have a scope to justify that you take a certain measure in relation to imports. Now, a third element I think has to do with the importance of looking not only at the situation domestically, but also at the situation in the exporting countries. Certain costs on your domestic producers, but you may actually find that you actually require imported products to comply with the same requirements. You may actually be imposing much more significant costs on the exporters. And particularly, you are talking about vulnerable developing countries. So I think these sort of issues are always going to be very, very important in any consideration. And you actually look, for instance, into the TRIMS Charter litigation in WTO, a lot of the litigation was about, is it legitimate to require that exporters have to comply with exactly the same requirement that you are imposing on your domestic producers. Fourthly, it is clear, and it was recognized in the SEALS case, that ethical concerns, animal welfare, can potentially be a basis for justifying a measure under Article 20A. But I have to say that it's also very clear that if you are going to do that, that you would really need to have a very, very solid and strong evidence to support the measure that you are taking, to show how it is clearly grounded on a widely perceived ethical concern, and it is not tainted by economic type of considerations. I mean, we have only had one real case of litigation in this area, which is the SEALS case. And when I discuss this with our litigators, they always tell me it was really critical that we have very strong evidence to justify the ethical concerns underlying the measure, that we could really show that there were no real humane alternatives to deal with the issues relating to the hunt of seals, and that therefore we had a very strongly grounded ethical case for the action that we were actually taking. And finally, I would say we should not forget that we should very much remain in a global optic of cooperation. If we wanted to improve animal welfare standards abroad, this has to be part of a dialogue, it has to be part of a cooperative approach with their countries. And one should always be careful when one takes certain autonomous action, that it is not an action which disrupts this climate of cooperation, which is going to be critical, I mean, for animal welfare issues, but also for the other type of global concerns which I have mentioned before. So all in all, I have to say this is issues that we are going to be looking at very closely in the Commission. I think Claire indicated that on certain initiatives an impact assessment is going to be undertaken, and one would need to look into different options. I mean, obviously, as a good civil servant, I cannot give you any sense about what would be the outcome of this impact assessment, but I just wanted to share with you some of the considerations which are not purely legal. I think they also come from my point of view to the question of the legitimacy of the actions that you might want to undertake. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ignacio. Extremely instructive for all of us to get a sense of what is the state, what are the questions that should be asked by any country willing to introduce those kind of measures. And my follow-up question would be, do we need to write them somewhere? Is there a case for rethinking, updating the TBT, the SPS, the notification system, or the system works as it is? I think we can leave this question open, and perhaps we're also going to hear from Jean-Marie on this specific question, where there's a debate thinking about the future of those agreements that really come back from the 1970, the Tokyo round, where this idea of non-trade concerns for the first time emerged and remain with us since 1995. Let me turn now to Cesc, who's going to bring us into the ground, because he works from Danone, as you heard. He's exposed on the reality of trade when it comes to an economic operator, and we're very curious to hear a little bit your perspective, your experience over time, because you're the global farming expert manager at Danone. How has Danone experience implementing higher standards of animal welfare on the ground, and how these standards vary between regions? How do you adapt?
Indeed, thank you so much also for the invitation. Very happy to bring this perspective in this panel, which is extremely interesting. It's an excellent question indeed, because as of course, I hope you all know that Danone is a global food company, right? We bring food to as many people as possible, and also now health through food. Right, so that is for us the purpose of doing business, right? So that's very clear, and you should know then that Danone, roughly 50% of our business is coming nowadays from what we call essential dairy and plant-based, because I already see some remarks in the chat to step away from animal-based products to solve some issues, but we already have that on the shelf, so we can already provide consumers also with an alternative. But that's part of the deal, because still, and then I come to my question, because really on the ground, we work with closely 400,000 farmers with all the products that we source in agriculture. Not all of them are animal related, but for the majority of that, we have a direct relationship with the farmers. We know where they live, we know how they treat their animals. And we do that in all continents. Right, so, and in all climate zones and all different varieties of development of the dairy industry, right? So that's where we know what's happening on the ground. And to this point, I want to emphasize as well that it's extremely difficult to start it. Let's say it's a super challenge to really come forward with applying a company strategy, and then going down to all of these countries, to all of these farmers in all of these regions, and try to deploy this strategy and motivate farmers to work on things. And then you should know that animal welfare is not a new topic to Danone, right? Very clear. All of the countries have been working long time on the improvement of animal welfare, also driven, of course, by local regulations. But in 2016, Danone has written a global positioning paper where we really said, okay, this is where globally as a company, with all the countries where we source milk, we want to work on. And with that in hand, we developed also a tool specifically on the dairy side of our business to really assess where are the farmers at, what's the practices currently at stake. And I put a lot of emphasis on the word assessment, because that also comes to answering the question here, how do we develop it on the ground, is really that we strongly believe that if you want to improve on animal welfare, it has to make sense in that region. It has to make sense on that farm. And yet, we want it to be compliant to a global strategy that we have as Danone, right? So what we did is indeed, we have an assessment where we go to a farm, where we interview the farmer, we look at animal observation, buildings, routines, KPIs, and all of those things give an image of where the farm is at. And that assessment is exactly the same in all the countries where we source milk, right? So all of our farms have had this kind of assessment. I say almost all. In 2020, we had 83% of our milk volume coming from farms that were assessed. So we know what's happening. Let's put it like that. We know what the things that go well, because that's also part of the assessment. We will really want to motivate farmers, but we also always have points to improve. And after this kind of assessment, my colleagues in the field who do this kind of assessment, they explain to the farmer an action plan. Where can they improve, right? So that's really something to really work on, and that means that there's a huge variety of strategic plans in different regions where farmers that deliver milk to Danone are working on. And one final point on that is that animal welfare is also part currently of what Danone is calling the regenerative agricultural strategy. It's one of the 3 pillars next to soil biodiversity and let's say having a new generation of farmers there. Animal welfare is particularly, it's the 3rd lever in this part. So it's strategically, it's all written down. But on the ground, this is how my colleagues and the farmers make it happen. And we've chosen specifically the topic to address, also to cooperate with big players in the upstream market, because we can put a strategy there to improve on the farm, but as soon as we leave another advisor with all good intentions, let me say it like that, does say that the farmer needs to, well, do something else, which might be conflicting with our strategy, the farmer doesn't know what to do, right? Danone says one thing while his advisor, local stakeholder, says something else. So therefore, we cooperate with global players in the market, and we really capture best practices. That's a program that's named Farming for Generation. But yeah, so it's a wide answer of how we as a global company have set the strategy. We go on the ground, really would want to facilitate and motivate farmers to improve animal welfare.
Thank you, Cesc, for giving your perspective and also highlighting some of the challenges that you face. Let me turn now to Laura to see a little bit how she sees this issue, building on Daniel Perez Vega question and comment, right? He's basically summing up the conversation so far when he says, well, products, the way in which products are made really matters to people. 90% of European citizens expect that what they buy on the European market correspond to the very same standard that exists within the Union when it comes to imported products. But overall, the trade regimes remains pretty much blind to production methods, besides the few exceptions that we have heard might fit into the system, but obviously the burden of proof remains on the country that is trying to introduce those measures. Laura, what is your perspective on this? Can we flip this? How can we do this? What are the most promising approaches?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Well, actually, I left academia in 2016 because I've been working on animal welfare and trade for 15 years, and I did not see anything move. Nobody in Denmark or at my university understood what I said when I started to discuss non-product related PPMs. Only a handful of people around the world actually understood what I said, and that was really not gonna, move anything with the politicians. Whenever I got an ambassador or a politician on the phone, or I even invited some people back to my home and discussed with them, they didn't really understand what I said. And can you hear me? Okay, great. So what I started to realize is what CES is talking about today is that companies can really move things. And when companies start making decisions, things are going fast. Whenever governments are making a decision to ban something, yes, we can go through the entire thing of GATT Article 20 and, you know, you and I understand what it means and we think it's great, and I've written a book about it, but there's not that many people out there in the world that understands it, and it's probably not going to move that much except for that particular trade measure whenever a country have the guts to enact that. So if we want to see real change also on the climate regulation, which basically now is a paper that's not even a treaty, and it's the biggest global problem that we have in the world. We don't have a treaty to regulate it, and that whenever we discuss that, it's about how we're going to limit it in my country, and then we're going to limit it in another country. And when we talk about trade, we also talk about trade restrictions. We never talk about how could we incentivize businesses? How could we make them want to make changes? How could we reward them? And if we look at that, I actually wrote a paper before I left the university about climate change and how to do that. And then I decided, forget it. I'm going to start working in a company. I'm going to start understanding what's really going on. So I quit my job. I was a tenured professor. People thought I was insane. I probably was. It's been very difficult. I started working in a company and I made so many mistakes. People thought I was a little bit stupid. Probably am. But I kind of caught up to it afterwards and started understanding how these decisions are made, where they are made. And if I start talk to somebody in the legal department in a company, I start talk to them about non-product related PPMs and GATT Article 20A, they've never heard about it. It's not part of their reality. You got to have a really big company before they get that. And that's when I started thinking about maybe I should go back to that one article that I wrote in the conversation with another professor at the university and start expanding on it. And that I'm so grateful that I can sit here and talk about this today, because I've left this world, but I would like to come back with my new experience. And if we look at how to do this, we can incentivize businesses. If we look at tariffs, we've worked with them for so many years. We're really good at using tariffs. What about if all products had, like when we go buy a refrigerator, we have to decide, do we buy one with an A or a B or a C? Think about if all products worldwide could tap into that, and that our tariffs would be based on whether it was an A, B, or C product. Think about if that was the future of the World Trade Organization and the World Customs Organization, to actually tackle this one problem that is going to be a major problem for our grandchildren, for the planet that they live on, and for millions of farm animals that are going through this every day. And we talk about changing a little dot. We talk about having one litigation in the WTO. We talk about one product related or non-product related PPM. But this could actually move things, because if a company is given the freedom to choose, okay, so am I going to produce a product that's an A and then I get duty-free treatment, or am I going to produce one that's going to be a B or a C, or maybe I'm taxed 5 or 10%? They're going to want to produce an A. They're going to strive towards this. They're going to do everything in their power to do this. And I know all the arguments against it. I know that people from the wet sciences are going to come in and say, how are we going to even put an A or a B or a C on the products? I know that that's going to be difficult. But if we don't do anything, and if we don't start rethinking this, we're going to end up not having a planet for our grandchildren. And I think I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your statements, and also for sharing your personal story and your frustration and your desire to come up with a possible solution. I don't know, Jean-Marie Pogam, how would you react to this provocative or pretty radical idea given the current circumstances? How would you think this would be implemented or discussed within the WTO? Not only focusing on more observability through labels that allow consumer to choose, but to actually embed this into the tariff system?
Well, thank you, Alberto. First, I have a confession to make to Laura, is that I do share your point that non-products related PPM is very much an insider issue and is being understood by approximately 5 to 10 people in the world. And me, myself, when I'm trying to approach that, I see some lawyers around the WTO who look at me suspiciously because they doubt that I can even understand the issue. So I will never try to give a legal opinion on this, but it's certain that, to make a long story short, we started with in 1947 with that was a new model of industrial society. So the products were based on more or less same processes of production. So the issue of like product came from that, and historically it can be understood. Now, PPM are coming back through, you mentioned it, carbon pricing, animal welfare, and that type of new issue which are entering the trade debate. And then we see two sides emerging. One side is more and more preoccupied with leveraging trade policy into achieving sustainable development objective or health objective. That's, of course, the European Union sensitivity. And the other side is very concerned that at the same time, introducing this element into trade policy will raise new trade barriers. So there is a risk of protectionism, which is being suspected, and would raise problems of capacities for developing countries to catch up with those complex debates. So depending on how we manage these tensions, there are always, on all these non-trade concerns, two possible scenarios. One is fragmentation through unilateral measures or regional measures, plus litigation at the WTO. Another one is marginalization, that is to say, okay, if the public policies or the international bodies are not able to take it up, then private standards will do. That's another risk for them. And the other scenario is about cooperation, dialogue, and trying to minimize, create understanding and minimize tension. Of course, we at the WTO are advocating for the second one. And we have a forum which has all the possibilities of discussion. By the way, it is an often unsung song of the WTO, is that many of these discussions, which are very technical, do take place in our SPS and TBT committees, and sometimes more often than you imagine, they bring amicable understanding and solution. So we have this possibility of creating this understanding. In the case of animal welfare, I think the fastest way to move things in the WTO is to influence the standard setting organization. Because we are not a standard setting organization. We do rely on external standards. When there is a standard, the WTO will really encourage its member to ground their measures on this. So this is in terms of lobbying, and some good lobby is about lobbying. That would be probably the fastest way. I'll stop it here, but we have this choice, and I hope that the countries will manage cooperation rather than litigation too.
Thank you, Jean-Marie, for your response. I know Reineke would like to step in as a reaction to Laura's comment. Reineke.
Yes, thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Laura, for your thought-provoking contribution. I'm a bit sad to see that you have given up also on governments and, for example, the EU to also really introduce trade restrictions, because we believe although corporate engagement and labeling could play a very important role, it should go hand in hand also with linking trade preferences to higher welfare standards, to sustainable farming practices, and really trying to shift from free trade to fair trade. And we don't believe that the corporate world can solve this itself. And that we need to look at an integration of both. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that. If not today, then another time, because I think it's really crucial to bring also corporate engagement and what corporates want to do in their CSR policies and government regulations more closely together, and then see how that indeed fits with the WTO's agenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reineke, for your call for experimentation around those issues and for political courage. There's a couple of questions coming and directed to Danone and to CES about, they need to give us some illustrations of what you're actually doing on the ground. What is the assessment of Danone concerning the welfare of dairy cows? What Danone is doing, for instance, to stop transport of calves and let dairy cows with their mothers? Can you give us some examples, illustrations?
Indeed. I think it's a very good question, which highlights one of the, let's say, typical issues. Indeed, if you source in so many countries and regions, right, you see all the practices from highly developed to well, let's say less developed, if I may say so. According to this assessment, and try to stay away from really the technical details in here, but in our assessment, we really look at multiple points on the calves as well. So, I mean, how is their housing, drinking possibilities, lying beds, but also when are they grouped? And that hits the point to the question here. We really like to motivate farmers. First of all, let me start differently. The current practice is really that they, as soon as the calf is born, right, they take it away from the mother to raise it separately, right, because of multiple reasons for hygiene, but also less mourning between the two animals, less binding, etc. What we try to do now is that at least if you put the calf away from the mother, then put it as young as possible. So within a few days after being born, put it in a group together with other calves. So then at least this social activity can start amongst those young animals. So that's a practice that we really encourage. To the question asker here about leaving the calves with the mother, that's an extremely, let's say, difficult topic in the current systems that we have in the dairy industry. It is good to know that we're very aligned with, let's say, scientists around the world that provide us with knowledge and the latest, let's say, best practices. And we really want to, make a step change there. But that's not an easy thing, right? Because that requires really change of farm environment, buildings, routines, etc. But it is something that is very much on our agenda. And within those alliances that I mentioned earlier, we really try to get best practices on the ground with this, right? But it's something that we promote, and we really put it as an action plan on the farm. But really making that step change, that requires time.
Thank you, Cez, for addressing this specific question. I don't know if there's any reaction here among the speakers on what you just heard. Laura, perhaps? No. Great. So what now we are getting a few more questions here. I see one looking a bit into the future. So how we can move this conversation forward. And I think Ignacio is very well placed to share with us his expectation. Do we need more black letter law? So to refine our textual, let's say, attempt at capturing reality? Do we need more litigation in order to push the system to move forward? Do we need more dialogue? So basically means status quo as one of the options. How do you see this debate moving forward?
No, thank you, Armeno. Alberto, that's a great question. Now, I am not convinced that the way forward is now pretending that we should be renegotiating the rules. I mean, if you actually look into the basic rules of the WTO, we are basically talking about 1947 rules, Article 3, Article 11, Article 20. And what I think the system has shown is that it is possible to build up a progressive interpretation of those rules. There has been a huge evolution about how Article 20 was being read in comparison to what it was when the WTO was created to the way that it has been in the more recent jurisprudence. And quite frankly, I would find it very difficult to imagine an intergovernmental negotiation established now that would come out with a more progressive, more modern view of looking into the balance of the rules. So in my view, the way forward is not to renegotiate the rules. The way forward is much more, I would agree with Jean-Marie Pogand. Can we actually try to find ways that animal welfare protection is seen not only as being a European concern, but a much more global concern? So the more that you can actually build these norms more broadly, the more that you can actually create, therefore, the incentives for business to see that this is important, not only when you want to sell in the European market, but also when you want to sell in other markets, the more that you actually foster a dialogue and cooperation about the issues, including talking about these issues in the WTO, because as Jean-Marie has said, probably at this point in time, it's a little bit of a taboo. There's too many things which are a taboo in the WTO that because people feel that the moment that you open up a conversation in Geneva is because you want to renegotiate the rules, it's very, very difficult to have certain conversations going. In my view, that's one of the problems that we have in the WTO. We should be able to talk in the WTO about animal welfare. We should be able to talk in the WTO about labor rights. All of these taboos in the WTO are how one needs to find a way of breaking those taboos.
Thank you, Ignacio, for your call for breaking taboos and creating more space for debate within WTO as a forum that somehow provide also direction to the international standard setting bodies that also are an engine, actually are the engine for moving this forward. Our conversation is coming to a close because of time. I think we touch upon many, not necessarily all the issues that are at stake ahead of this summit, but we really hope to have advanced the conversation by connecting a few dots and also underlining the importance of considering and approaching and perceiving animal welfare as an essential part of not only sustainable food systems and broader sustainability, but also as a key feature of the multilateral trade regime as it is emerging or undergoing a modernization today. Our encouragement today is really to explore the UN Food System Summit on Thursday with or through the lens of trade and animal welfare in mind. I think we are really working together to put this issue on the agenda and making sure it become much more salient by gaining a bit more, let's say, the attention that it deserves. On this note, let me thank you all the speakers for joining us today and for generous contribution. You're going to receive the recorded version of our debate today, so it would be possible to stay in touch and continue thinking about this issue. Thank you so much on behalf of the Eurogroup for Animals and the Good Lobby.